Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ted Ruger. I'm the Dean of Penn Law School. It is my tremendous pleasure to welcome you all here today for the Stephen S. Goldberg and Jolley Bruce Christman Lecture in Education Law. We're tremendously honored to have Cornell Brooks here with us today, and I'm very much looking forward to his talk and to and then to a dialogue who we'll have with our Provost Wendell Pritchett. This, like much of the good things that happen here in the Penn Law building, is fundamentally a cross-disciplinary enterprise. We're working in partnership with colleagues from across the university, in this case, both the Graduate School of Education, and the Provost's office. So my main role is, again, just to heartily welcome you here to the law school and to this great event. And I will now turn over to my colleagues both to more properly introduce our distinguished guest and to introduce this event. So after I speak, we will have, I want to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Pam Grossman, who is the Dean of the Graduate School of Education. Pam, thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for that warm welcome and also for the use of this fabulous space. We appreciate being able to be here. And I'm delighted to see so many of you, so many members of the Penn GSE community, the Penn Law community, the university community more broadly, students and alumni. It's great to see you all here, and it's a testament to the importance and relevance of today's talk on education law. Our talk today by Cornell Brooks, former president of the NAACP, is made possible through the generosity of Stephen S. Goldberg and Jolley Bruce Christman. This was conceptualized by Stephen prior to his death in 2006, and the lecture now honors his memory and contributions to the field of education law. The lecture provides an opportunity for leaders, researchers, practitioners, parents, and students to learn from one another and through the challenges we face in our schools and communities today. Jolley, who joins us today, was instrumental in bringing the Stephen S. Goldberg and Jolley Bruce Christman Lecture in Education Law to fruition. A Penn GSE alumnus, friend, civic leader, community, and volunteer, and a passionate educator, Dr. Christman has made a significant impact on Philadelphia and its educational community for more than 4 decades. Originally a history and English teacher, yay for history and English teachers and the humanities, at a neighborhood high school in Philadelphia, Dr. Christman co-founded the Research for Action with Eva Gold in 1992. Research for Action, which is still going strong today, seeks to use research as the basis for improvement of educational opportunities and outcomes for traditionally underserved students. Dr. Christman currently serves as president of the board of directors of the Fleischer Art Memorial, which makes art accessible to everyone, regardless of economic means, background, or artistic experience. She also chaired the Board of Trustees at Randolph College, and until recently served as a trustee at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, her hometown. From the moment I met Jolley, she has always exuded infectious enthusiasm for her passions. And those of you who know Jolley won't be surprised by that. Those passions include educational access and opportunity for all, regardless of life circumstances. This is a passion that she shared with her late husband, Stephen, who was also a Penn alumnus, an affiliated faculty member, and a long-standing professor at Arcadia University. So we feel incredibly fortunate to have benefited from this passion and to be able to share this conversation with a much broader group. We also feel incredibly fortunate with our choice of the inaugural keynote speaker for this lecture. Cornell Brooks offers expertise, experience, and enthusiasm for the field of education law and its impact. Until June, Mr. Brooks served as the president of the NAACP, one of the nation's largest and oldest civil rights organization. Under his leadership, the organization adopted the NAACP Plan of Action for Charter Schools, which called for a moratorium on the expansion of charter schools. And his remarks today, false and Faustian traditional and charter school choices, will shed new light on the schisms, choices, and consequences for the charter school movement and traditional public education. As we all know, this is a controversial and hot topic, but one that, I think people have given a lot of thought to, so we're looking forward to his remarks. He's now a visiting professor of social ethics law and justice movements at Boston University, where he earned his master's degree in divinity, and he has additional appointments at Harvard and Yale Law School. Mr. Brooks was a classmate of Provost Pritchett's at Yale Law School, so it's particularly fitting that they're going to be in conversation today following the talk. And Provost Pritchett is a perfect participant in the event. We invited him, by the way, before he became provost, and he generously agreed to stay on after his appointment, as he too bridges the worlds of law and education. In addition to serving as provost, he's a member of the law school faculty and also a secondary member of the GSE faculty, so he literally bridges our faculties. He's had firsthand experience in education, both as an administrator in higher education and as a member of the School Reform Commission in Philadelphia. And we're so grateful that he's agreed to participate in today's event. So you all understand that what will happen is that we'll start with the lecture by Cornell Brooks, and that will be followed by a conversation with Provost Pritchett. You all have an index card in front of you, or you should find an index card in front of you, and we welcome you to write down any questions you have that arise for you in the context of either the conversation or the lecture. We'll be collecting those cards midway through, and then we'll be using those to structure the question and answer period. So I hope you will all join me in providing a warm welcome to our visitor, Cornell Brooks.
Good afternoon. It gives me a great deal of honor to be here at the University of Pennsylvania, to be in the midst of so many colleagues and friends who are concerned about this matter of education. First of all, let me express my appreciation to the deans of the School of Education and the School of Law for extending to me this opportunity to speak to all of you, and certainly to my classmate, whom I knew in law school, had an opportunity to see his good work at Rutgers Camden, and to see that work continue here at Penn. I want to also express appreciation for this lecture series. In public life, there are moments where there's quite often more heat than light, and so occasions where we have an opportunity to speak to issues that people are concerned about, issues that go to the core of what this country represents in a thoughtful, passionate, but appropriately dispassionate way, are opportunities that we relish and appreciate. So to the conveners, to the supporters, I simply want to say thank you. Now, as may have been noted, I come to the Academy in a rather circuitous route. I'm a fourth-generation ordained minister as well as a public interest or civil rights lawyer. And so, as such, I've always had occasions to speak to a variety of audiences. And I want to note today that I've not always been so fortunate to speak to such an august assembly of scholars and practitioners. In fact, I can think of a time many years ago when, as a young seminarian, I found myself in London, England on a Sunday morning. And as a young seminarian, I found myself standing outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral, with spires soaring up toward the heavens. And as a young seminarian, I suppose that there were about 1,000 or so people inside waiting to hear this young, innocent, naive, presumptuous preacher preach. Now, I made my way into the sanctuary, and I immediately noticed the obvious: the pastor and exactly two members. One member I'll call Miss Jones, the other member I'll call Miss Smith. Now, I did as I was taught to do, which is to say you speak, you share, you preach to two people in the same way that you would to 2,000, with sincerity, with conviction, with a sense of one's calling to public service. As I began to speak, I immediately noticed the obvious, that the member I'll call Miss Jones immediately fell asleep. True story. Now, this inspired me to speak with more vigor, with more passion, with more enthusiasm. And as I did so, I noticed that the member called Miss Smith seemed to hang on to every word I had to say. She nodded her head, she tapped her toes, she clapped her hands, and as is the case in my religious tradition, she said hallelujah and amen at all the right theological moments. Now, as I concluded my little homily, I made my way to the side of the pastor, and the pastor said to me, "Brother Brooks, I'm so sorry. Miss Jones falls asleep on everyone, and Miss Smith is out of her mind and did not understand a thing you had to say." So you can see why I'm delighted to be in the midst of this august assembly, addressing so thoughtful and so serious a topic. I come to this podium this afternoon with a particular burden for this matter of education. As my bio may make you aware, while I'm a graduate of Yale Law School, I'm also a graduate of Head Start. I came to the NAACP and was announced as the new president and CEO of the NAACP on the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. I came to the NAACP with a peculiar and particular civil rights legacy and lineage. My grandfather, the Reverend James Edmund Prelo, hailing from the low country of South Carolina, ran for Congress in the 1940s in the wake of a Supreme Court decision entitled Smith versus Allwright, outlawing the all-white Southern Democratic primary. I note this because Thurgood Marshall, no less a figure than Thurgood Marshall, counted Smith versus Allwright and the Brown versus Board of Education decision as the two most important cases of his career and the two most important cases in the legal, and I would argue the moral legacy of the NAACP. Of course, Brown versus Board of Education struck a near-lethal blow to the doctrine of separate but equal and Jim Crow. And Smith versus Allwright was really a decision not merely about African Americans gaining access to the ballot box and gaining access to public office, but Smith versus Allwright was really a decision about political empowerment. And so I come to this podium, come to this moment, thinking about education, both in terms of educational resources for our most vulnerable children, our most vulnerable citizens' children, but also political empowerment in terms of the communities in which they're raised, that they come from, and hopefully they are dedicated to serving. I come to this particular discussion with a burden and a need to be candid about the choices we face at this anguishing hour of our democracy. You will recall that the NAACP summer before last assembled at its 107th annual convention. And the delegates of the NAACP passed a modest resolution calling for a moratorium on the expansion of charter schools. The CEO at that time had no idea that this modest resolution perpetuating, articulating a long-standing policy of the NAACP would ignite a firestorm. It is important at this point to say a little something about how these resolutions come into being. The NAACP, as you know, is the nation's oldest and largest and most widely recognized civil rights organization, representing 2,000 or so units across 50 states of these United States, represented in small towns, large cities, military installations, high schools, Native American reservations, literally every corner of the republic. A resolution can come to the floor in two ways. It can come to the floor as a matter of the creation or the initiation of the president and CEO, but resolutions more often come to the floor from the grassroots, from people who represent their communities across the length and breadth of our country. This resolution was passed first by the California Nevada Conference of the NAACP. This was not a matter of fine legal craftsmanship. It was an expression of grassroots concern. Among the delegates of the NAACP, you will find very few investment bankers. You will find very few folks who have PhDs in education. You will find a great many public school teachers, police officers, firefighters. You'll find folks who represent literally the diversity of the American workforce, and they represent literally the diversity of the country. They hail from virtually every school district in the country. This resolution was passed overwhelmingly. In a matter of only a few days, we took note of the fact that editorial boards across the country roundly condemned it. On the pages of the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles papers, the Wall Street Journal, again and again and again, editorial boards weighed in against the resolution. It's important for us to ask the question, well, what precisely were the concerns of the delegates? Those concerns were simply a handful. Namely, they were concerned about the segregation, as they put it, of our public schools, meaning separating those who have obvious talents from those whose talents are less obvious, not yet readily apparent, not yet fully developed, along racial lines and along the lines of gifts and abilities. They also lifted up a concern about discipline. The fact that in many charter schools, though not all charter schools, and not unlike many traditional public schools, we find many of our most vulnerable citizens subject to unfair disciplinary practices. In fact, the delegates talked about a kind of backdoor admissions process. That is to say, students are admitted through the front door through a lottery, but literally weeded out at the back door through an unfair disciplinary process. They expressed concerns about this. Number three, they expressed a real deep concern about how resources were being allocated in their communities. We had delegates talk about the fact that where resources are scarce and where the NAACP is often on the forefront of making the case for public education. And I might note parenthetically that with the NAACP making the case vigorously, in a sustained way, day in and day out, whether it's popular or not, for support of public education, it is in fact a voice for the support of charter school education. Because those who argue for more resources for public education that includes charter schools as a part of the mix are in fact arguing for support of charter schools that truly support the education of the whole, the breadth, and the entirety of the public. These delegates expressed concern about the fact that in school districts where we have concentrations and hyper-concentrations of children with special needs, children for whom English is not their first language, children who come from households that are troubled with troubles that are not of their creation, but imposed on them by the larger society, namely high rates of unemployment, high rates of crime, low investment in communities, poor health care. In such communities where the schools are strapped for resources and unfair, inequitable funding formulas load up the traditional public school with the students who are the most expensive to educate, and allow some charter schools to essentially cream and educate those who are most effectively, I should say, most efficiently from a cost perspective, educated, they took exception to that. They also took exception to the lack of transparency and accountability with respect to charter schools. Some charter schools. These delegates also expressed real concerns about what happens where the standards for accountability and the lack of transparency allow some charter schools to recruit across the summer, enroll in September, and close by December without accountability. And so these delegates articulated a demand not for the whole-scale closure, the existential annihilation of charter schools, but they called for a moratorium on the expansion of charter schools, which you might characterize as a reasoned pause. So in the midst of this ongoing debate within the ranks of the NAACP, now let me make it clear to you, the NAACP is not the kind of organization where consensus is reached readily and maintained daily. It is in fact the kind of organization where you have people who literally bring their heart for this republic, their heart for civil rights, their heart for justice to the work. And as a consequence, it animates vigorous debates. And so, the delegates pass a resolution. The board of the NAACP, including a somewhat bewildered CEO, tried to make sense of what was being played out on the pages of the country's editorial pages. In the October board meeting, in the wake of vociferous, unyielding condemnation, the board faced a choice. They could retreat, or they could reflect the will of the body and the concerns of the delegates. During the October board meeting, the board ratified the resolution. But they did something else. They also decided on their own, raising money on their own, paying individually to attend and support a series of hearings around the country that they might hear from, yes, members of the NAACP, but also members of the public on both sides and on the many sides, not both sides, the many sides of this issue. So there were hearings held in literally every corner of the country. And what we heard over and over and over again was that people were concerned not primarily with charter schools as such, traditional public schools as such, but they were concerned about their education of their children first and foremost. What we saw over and over again were not assemblies of ideologues or partisans. In fact, there was a bit of wisdom that came from the lips of a 6-year-old girl who stood at a hearing in New York City. And she announced to this overflow crowd that my name is, and I've forgotten her name, my name is, I'm 6 years old, I am in first grade, I am a member of the NAACP, and I love my charter school. And then she proceeded to make the case for her school. And she proceeded to make the case that every child should have what she has in her school. And she was surrounded by parents and grandparents who made the case that every school should deliver effectively for the children in their care. Across the country, we heard over and over again that the concerns that animated the resolution were valid. Now, the research can be quite bewildering to the average parent, certainly to children. When you say that charter schools outperform traditional public schools, particularly in cities, not so much in suburbs. Mixed results when it comes to privately run, or I should say, private charter schools. The research and the methodological questions and ambiguities are lost on many members of the public. And so while we debate whether or not charter schools as such categorically outperform traditional public schools, what's lost is how do people feel about their schools and their children, and a certain generational impatience when it comes to delivering for their future. So in other words, we cannot argue that we must save the whole of the public school system as the children wait. We certainly cannot argue that we found the magic bullet, we found the catch-all solution in the manner of traditional, I should say, in the manner of charter schools. What we have across the country are people who are looking at their schools in their communities. Left out of this debate is also the matter of what the schools have been charged to do. Now, certainly in the wake of industrialization, suburbanization, of employment and opportunities, the schools have a critical role to play in terms of preparing our children to compete in a global economy. This is not lost on parents. They understand that. They understand that this matter of preparing our children to compete in the global economy has everything to do with the quality of instruction. It has everything to do with the equity of the resources. It also has much to do with who controls and who has a say in their schools. Not unrelated to this question is a question lifted up by no less a figure than John Dewey, namely that the schools play a critical role in preparing our children for citizenship. This is not an abstract question for those who are concerned about civics. It is a morally urgent question, particularly in the midst of this Twitter-age civil rights movement. Because when we consider that this whole traditional public school, charter school debate took place in the midst of and in the wake of the Flint water crisis, where we had literally a generation of children poisoned as a consequence of the loss of local control, we have parents and grandparents who look at those schools and say to themselves, what happens to our future? What happens to our children if we don't have a say in how they're educated? This is not an irrelevant question in terms of public education. And so when we talk about control over the local public school, autonomy with respect to the local public school, localism with respect to the local public school, it is not enough to simply say we need to have a metric-driven, child-centric conversation about education in this country without delving into these messy matters of community control. Parents understand intuitively the history of the desegregation and resegregation, if you will, of public education. They understand that in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, we saw a decimation of the ranks of African American teachers. They understand intuitively that where we have a loss in the ranks of African American public school teachers, we also see a loss with respect to the number of graduates from those same schools. They understand that statistically, they understand it empirically, they understand it experientially. And if I might note, personally, as the grandson of a public school teacher and a public school principal who said to me that Brown versus Board of Education was a wonderful thing. But when we lost our black teachers, when we lost our black schools, when we lost our sense of autonomy, our sense of community, we also lost something in terms of educational excellence. At this hour, I simply say to you, the choices we face, I believe, have often been false and Faustian. Quite often the choice has been, you can wait on a public school system that will never be saved, or you can place your hopes, your dreams in terms of the next generation on the charter school that's available to you through a lottery. People intuitively, and certainly the delegates of the NAACP, rejected such a choice. They see it as a Faustian choice, a deal made with the devil. Because ultimately, we all have a responsibility to invest in our public schools. We all have a responsibility to ensure that they are in fact excellent schools. And so when we look at the hearings, when we look at the report that was issued by the NAACP that calls for investing in our schools, that calls for yes, accountability, calls for yes, transparency, yes, addressing the disciplinary discrepancies, but it also calls for an end to privatization. Now, when we look at Michigan as opposed to Tennessee, interestingly enough, the Tennessee State Conference of the NAACP, in the wake of the resolution, disagreed a little bit with national policy at the grassroots level. Because in Tennessee, privately run, I should say private charter schools are barred. In Michigan, where we have a proliferation of such schools, we see some of the most vigorous support for the charter school public education policy of the NAACP. Here's the point. This issue is more than a matter of research nuance. It's also a matter of community nuance. It has everything to do with how we speak about the issue, whom we include in the conversation, whom is deemed to be qualified to participate in the conversation. And the fact that we have this conversation about public education in response to the NAACP framing it in civil rights terms has everything, says quite a bit about the degree to which we have alienated ourselves from children and the parents. We can't escape that. The fact that we had a consensus response by the editors of the nation's leading newspapers in response to the nation's oldest civil rights organization lifting up concerns from grassroots folks may say something about the degree to which we speak to one another and the degree to which we are well positioned to address these issues. I said at the outset that I'm a graduate of Head Start. Head Start, as you know, came into being not merely because it was great educational policy. It came into being on the backs of civil rights activists who understood that education was a civil rights priority. This conversation today is far too important, far too morally urgent for us to be boxed into categories, separate camps. We have to have a rational, thoughtful, child-centric, but also community-centric conversation about traditional public education and charter schools. The NAACP's report, if you read the text and the subtext, suggests that the NAACP is ready for such a debate, that parents are ready for such a debate, communities are ready for such a debate. The issue for us is whether those charged with the responsibility of implementing education policy in this country are ready for such a debate. With that said, thank you.
Ready? Thank you. I look forward to telling former Dean, now President Fitz, that we're really celebrating him here today. So again, thank you all for coming. I also want to say thank you to Jolley for your support. I hope that you are feeling, we're not done yet, but this, I think, was the vision that you had for, you and your husband had for this. So thank you. Thank you. And we're not done yet. And I also want to thank my friend for being willing to come. So my recollection is that you were actually a year ahead of me in law school. We were in the same class, and I say that because my recollection is that I even viewed you in law school as an old head that I looked to for advice. So that's why I raised that.
Amazing what 1 year will do.
And I also say I remember having conversations, which I think won't be very different than what we're about to do, except for there are people watching. And I just have to say, well, when we have those conversations, I'm not surprised at all where you are in the amazing contributions that you've made over the last 25 years. So thank you.
Thank you.
You know, as a good law school cafeteria conversation starts, let's start with building a little bit a foundation. And I'm going to ask you a couple questions that you really did talk about already, but I just want to kind of again build that foundation to help us all have the deep conversation that you and I both and all of us would like to have. So, from your perspective, and also from the many people that you've talked to, could you boil down? And again, you've talked about this a little bit already. What are the 3, 4, 5 top goals of our educational system in your mind? What should our schools be doing?
Mm-hmm. So clearly parents want their children to be well educated to compete in the workforce. This is critically important, particularly in an age where we have seen declining wages. We have seen not just American workers lose ground, but particular communities lose ground. So that is a practically urgent matter. Secondly, parents, grandparents, communities want schools to be anchor institutions. when we talk about anchor institutions, we often talk about universities. But the public school system, public schools or local public school, is in fact an anchor institution for the community. That's critically important because where teachers are seen in the grocery store, in the street, they're pillars of the community. That is not lost when you bring in teachers who live elsewhere, who are not rooted in the community. That creates a great amount of community anxiety. Third, as was lifted up before, going back to the days of the Greeks, John Dewey, but I would also argue the civil rights tradition in this country, that schools prepare our young people for citizenship, not in an antiquated, old-fashioned notion in terms of traditional civics, but preparing students, young people for citizenship in terms of vindicating their rights, in terms of understanding their rights, in terms of making this country live out, realize, fulfill the ideals that it claims to hold. This is not a romantic notion, because when you talk to people about what their schools should be doing, they talk in terms of preparing their young people for leadership, not merely to be employees, but to be leaders, not merely to be entrepreneurs, but leaders. These are three fundamental goals. But I want to emphasize the anchor institutions, because where I've seen it across the country in places certainly like Newark and Baltimore, where schools are seen as places to equip children to compete in the workforce as though they're independent economic units relative to their families, it's alienating and unappreciated.
Yeah, thank you. I should mention again that if you have questions, we have some of our students who are walking around. Please pass in your questions, and Cornell and I will be talking for a little while, but we're really interested in what you want to ask him too. So thank you for that inspirational answer. A second question, related question. So how do we measure success? If our schools were working, what would it look like? And again, you've started to answer this. You've already given us some really articulate thoughts on this, but I just want to, again, build a foundation. And obviously, let me make clear, I'm not talking about test scores. What would success look like? What would you like to see that you could declare we've really made progress?
So certainly, success looks like test scores, but not only test scores, as you lifted up. In many of our communities, success looks like preparing young people to be contributors to their communities as opposed to being de facto wards of the state, as in being caught up in the criminal justice system. Having spent 7 years working in Newark, working with hundreds and hundreds of ex-offenders, I never met anyone who didn't take that first step toward the criminal justice system outside of the public school system having failed them. So that's got to be a measure of success. So in other words, we look at the degree to which schools ensure that their students are not only graduates, but they never graduate from the juvenile justice system or the adult criminal justice system. In terms of measures, we certainly have to look at the degree to which the schools serve the whole of the population. So it's not enough for us to have elite schools that have 100% college placement rates, which is wonderful, but having had the experience of sitting on a stage and honestly counting the number of boys, counting the number of boys with honor cords, counting the number of boys who leave, graduate, go to college, and decline to come back home after freshman year.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of educating boys and girls. It's also a matter of educating students whose gifts are not readily apparent. So for example, we treat the most elite public schools in ways that we don't treat the most elite private schools. In the most elite private schools, there's an understanding some children mature at different rates. There are different cognitive or developmental windows. And so in elite private schools, we supplement the curriculum with tutors. We try to mature the children with services. In some of the best traditional public schools and even best charter schools, we cream. We take the students who are the most compliant, who are the easiest to fit in, and we find a way to get rid of the others. So one measure of success has to be the degree to which you educate the range of students well. Boys and girls, children of all different abilities, and those whose abilities mature at different rates.
Thank you. Thank you again, especially. Please. Appreciate your focus on educating and supporting all children. I completely agree with you. So you alluded to the fact that you were activists in Newark for many years. I wanted to talk for a second about the fact that you've done so many different things in your career. You are a minister. You are an activist. You are an organizational leader. You are a lawyer.
What happens when you can't decide what you want to be when you grow up?
Well, actually, that's the question I want to ask, and I admit this is an idiosyncratic way, and maybe we can talk it through. But those things are somewhat in tension sometimes when we think about the issue that we're talking about. How do we improve our schools, right? And so let me ask it this way, and you can answer it a different way. Which one of those different roles wins in your mind when they're fighting within your head about how you'd like to see our schools improve?
The ministry provides the why, the law provides the how. I've just always believed that if you have a compelling why, it's easy to reach a practical how. And I find that the most self-aware lawyers are the same, even the ones who don't go to seminary, right? Namely, you begin with why. What does the client want? What's the goal here? What's the purpose? Why are we doing this work? What gives us meaning? And then we settle down and try to figure out, well, how do we carry this out? Yeah. So when we think about the Voting Rights Act, you have clergy in Selma and lay folks all across the country saying, we think the best way to protect the right to vote is thus and so. Attorneys, Nicholas Katzenbach, the president, you all figured it out. Yeah. We know where we want to go. Yeah. We want the law to take us there. And I think as lawyers, that's what we're charged with doing.
Good. So you answered the question for two parts. So let's talk about the activist and the organizational leader. And those are particularly in tension often, right? The idea of being an activist and being an organizational leader. So I could ask a question, but you're already nodding, so just share some thoughts.
So I think this is true not only for the NAACP, I think it's true for many of our millennial activists, right? In that we create organizations in the midst of ongoing social justice challenges. Organizations have, as part of their purpose, self-perpetuation, institutional perpetuation. But you have these causes and concerns which are urgent, which are ever evolving. And so there come moments when you can respond to the cause and concern, moments when you serve the institution, moments when you serve both, and sometimes moments when they're in tension. And ultimately, I believe that you have to remember why you go to these institutions. It's sort of like with lawyers. We have to remember why we took the bar, not just that we passed. Right?
Yeah. So can I push you on that a little bit? Let me ask it this way. In the follow-up after the resolution was passed, and you toured the country and you talked to both NAACP members and lots of other people. Let me ask it this way. What are some positive outcomes from this relatively contentious, this contentious debate within your organization? What things did you hear on the road that made you think, all right, maybe this helped us make at least a little bit of progress?
Mm-hmm. The things we heard on the road were, we're concerned about our kids' education. NAACP policy, If that helps my child, fine. If it doesn't, I couldn't care less about it. What we heard pretty consistently was you all are having this debate in terms of which schools perform best. You have various studies that don't seem to be readily understood in terms of delivering some kind of consensus. You have all these methodological debates, suburban schools, urban schools. I think what we heard was over and over again, focus on what would deliver results in real time for children with less of a focus on ideology or less of a focus on institutional self-perpetuation. So for example, if I were candidate in that debate, the resolution, I think even the authors of the resolution would say it expressed real grassroots concern.
Yeah.
Was it a model of legal craftsmanship initially? The first draft? Perhaps not. But was it authentic? Did it identify the real issues? And did it give rise to a process that further debate? Absolutely. And I think the nation's editorial pages, once they looked at the report, once they considered the fact that NAACP went to places where we were cheered and roundly booed. Now, some of the folks who are the most vocal and vociferous in this debate, I don't see them going to some of the places we went. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily see them going to church basements or synagogues or union halls and saying, tell us what you think. So I think that was constructive.
Yeah, thank you. I'll ask you two questions. I'll tell you the second one before I ask the first one. So the second one is...
Such a law professor.
Yeah, sorry, I am. You've encouraged us, and I completely agree, that we need to figure out how policymakers, I'm going to rephrase what you said, but I think this is what you said. How can policymakers and communities cooperate to make our schools everything they should be for our children? Okay, so that's the second question, and you started to talk about this, but I'd love to invite you to talk a little bit more about that. But let me ask a first question that may lead us to that. This tension between I need to take care of my child, and I need to take care of my child right now, and the acknowledgement that everybody has that we need to take care of all of our children. Everybody knows that. But those are deeply in tension. How do you think moving forward, and again, not only your perspective, but perspectives that you heard, mm-hmm. How can we reconcile those things so that we really feel like we're doing both of those things?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it first begins with not taking certain questions off the table. So for example, we have some, not all, but some who support charter schools who will say conversations about and questions about any other stakeholder in the educational enterprise other than children is invalid. To talk about teachers is to not talk about children. To talk about teachers is to talk about teachers' unions. To talk about community control is to talk about abdication of children. Leave those questions, leave those concerns off the table. Similarly, there are those who are supporters of traditional public schools who sometimes have these conversations where the focus on teachers may give the impression that there isn't a primacy with respect to the focus on children. There's also a tendency to take the whole issue of generational urgency off the table. Namely, to talk about systemic reform, to talk about investing in wraparound services. All those things are great. But unless you're talking about doing this in a way that delivers in the near term. So the example I would always use is working with ex-offenders, with juvenile justice. I used to tell my staff, if it takes us 7 years to pass a bill, we've lost a generation. So we have to work like we're trying to save lives now. So thinking about what can be done congressionally, which is a synonym for glacially, not enough. Right?
Yeah, thank you. So then the follow-up question, how can we policymakers and communities partner and maybe even invite you to think about, what things are you wanting to advocate for us to do in the next year? And then also the next 3 and 5 years. And as I give you a second to think about this, I would say one of the many tensions that I felt in this world is, so I have been a policymaker. I've always tried to advocate, to communicate. Actually, I'm a member of the community too, who has 2 kids in schools. And I do think that there are tensions on both sides. So I do think that we should, and you've said this many times, community members are policymakers. They need to be fundamental deciders of what our policies are, right? But I also do think that one of the frustrating divisions, again, as a policymaker, is sometimes the frustration I felt is people often looked at me as not a member of the community, right? So I in some way, an outsider who's making decisions for others. So I'm partly talking to give you a chance to think about these questions. But again, my question is, how can communities in the next year, what are some of your thoughts about some specific concrete things that communities and policymakers can do to partner to improve our schools?
So just one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about, and I think is particularly important, is how do we measure our schools in terms of the range of students they serve? So to the degree that we look at schools in terms of college placement rates, great. But we also have to look at them in terms of the number of boys, number of girls. How are we serving children in terms of raising children from this level to this level? They started here, they ended up here. We have to develop better, deeper, more balanced, more humane metrics with respect to the school, make those metrics transparent, and begin to talk about them. Yeah. Because that way, it simultaneously increases expectations and accountability. Yeah. I think that is absolutely key. Second part of this is building the basis of support for the public schools. Because right now, I just find it ironic that you have communities where you have some schools that don't really have a PTA, and other schools where the PTA is a committee of investment bankers in the same community. Yeah. Now, make no mistake, I think investment bankers investing in public schools, this is a wonderful thing. Yeah. Yeah. This is not a bad thing at all. But we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we have schools side by side where we can say, we've delivered here, or, as we heard in New York, I had heard parents who said, I've got one child going into a school that will condemn them to a lifetime of unemployment, and another child going to another school where their banners, hanging in the hallways, banners from Penn, from Harvard, from Yale, Amherst, and the like. That's a problem. The point being here is we've got to build the basis of support. What we've got to basically say is, if you support charter schools, you've got to support public education, broadly speaking. Because I meant what I said at the beginning. To some of my charter school colleagues and friends, I say the NAACP has been your best friend, because you would not even be in the public schools. You would not have your slice of the resource pie, but for the NAACP's advocacy and litigation. Point, period, paragraph.
Yeah, thank you. I want to start taking questions from the audience, and as Grossman, you're going to bring them up, or thank you. Just 2 quick reflections that were in my head as you were just talking. So one, I'm sure in this room, many people read an article in the New York Times, which was last spring, and it was focused on Santa Monica School District, and the principal actually declared that they weren't going to have fundraisers at individual schools because there is a big disparity among the schools, and that any money raised for the schools would go into a pot that would be allocated equitably among all the schools. I don't know whether you saw this, and of course, when I read the article, my first reaction was, I want to go back in 6 months and see whether that superintendent is still in her job. And I wasn't able to, I haven't been able to do that, so maybe somebody will check that.
Somebody has this on Google as we speak.
Check that for me, because it did seem like a brilliant response to an extremely difficult question. And another thought that I had, reflection I had, and we have so many people here that are thinking about these questions, and when we think about metrics, and again, not just focus on test scores, I think my personal view is that that's a small measure, though relevant, that in developing metrics as academics,
Right.
we're not always sensitive to what metrics families have, and that those metrics are equally, if not more, important. And among the questions that we have to figure out is how to merge both of those standards. Yeah. So we have a bunch of questions for you. So I'll start with this one. How will a moratorium change the system of education in a way that helps achieve the success you mentioned?
So if we think about a moratorium as literally a reasoned pause, we take an occasion to stop the expansion and to consider what things we might do to ensure equity in funding, very specifically. Where we see some charter schools not serving the full range of students, not bearing the same cost with respect to transportation and other services. If a locality, a jurisdiction says, before we expand, we address this, that's reasonable. I mean, for example, this is often done in terms of regulatory policy. We say we're going to hit a pause button with respect to this before we do that. How is it that when it comes to children, if we say, let's pause, make an adjustment, this seems like radical policy. I think it just reflects common sense on behalf of parents.
Thank you. These are excellent questions. Another one. This is about the idea of community-based schools as community anchor institutions. So the question is, are you thinking about schools as community-based centers and organizing sites for community development, as well as sites for the delivery of school-based or linked health and social services? I know this is something that you thought about even before NAACP.
Yeah. Certainly both. I mean, where we have schools, and I'll give you an example. In Newark, I was talking to a principal who we were discussing why don't parents attend PTA meetings. And he said to me, he said, here's the problem. If the school that disserved you is presently disserving your children, but it's the only school available to you, are you going to be psychologically inclined to go to that school even if it's with your child?
Yeah.
His thought, certainly my thought and any number of educators, talk about deepening the bonds between the schools and the community. So to the extent that the school is a place where people go for community services, go in terms of a place where they go to do the business of being leaders in their community, places where they get services for their families and for their children, employment opportunities. It builds the bond between the community and the school, and certainly bridges the gap between the community and the school, and literally makes the school more effective with respect to traditional education, or education traditionally defined. This is not radical. It's not a radical prescription. This happens in suburbs every day, right? Not necessarily all the wraparound services, but with respect to schools being meeting places, schools being, of course, places where people vote, schools being places and sources of pride. That's true for the community, but it's also true for individual students. So when you talk to principals, and the principals say, now, sports can be an important academic bridge to the extent that sports properly used, create a sense of loyalty to the school, a sense of identity in the community, and creates a bond. My experience in Newark was I had any number of young men tell me, I played sports. I got cut from the team, and then I started hanging with the wrong crowd.
Yeah.
Sports was a way of validating who they were connecting with school. So any bonds that we can create between school and community, I think is important on a variety of platforms.
Thank you. Thank you. So next question, and this is celebrating something that just happened today, and I'm glad the writer did ask this, so you might not know this, but just today, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled. So before you clap, let me tell everybody what happened, and then you can clap again. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that the state's funding scheme is a justiciable matter. Now, the lawyer in me, the law professor in me wants to explain what that means, and then we can clap. So that meant that a case about school funding in the state of Pennsylvania that was brought by several school districts was not immediately dismissed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now we have lots of work left to do. Now let's clap for that. Let's clap for that. I'm going to editorialize for a second. Sadly, in Pennsylvania, that's major progress because we've been fighting that issue, if whether it is even a justiciable matter for 20 more years, where many other places have at least moved past that. So after that editorializing and our cheering of our progress, let me ask you a question.
I'm happy about that. 20 years.
Do you think that impact litigation is a good strategy for pursuing educational equity? And let me add a little bit of reform to that. In what ways? What is the role of litigation in our educational reform efforts?
So if I draw a parallel with voting, because I did at the outset in terms of Brown v. Board of Education and Smith versus Allwright. If we think about where we are with respect to voting rights post-Shelby, right? So we see this Machiavellian frenzy of voter disenfranchisement from one end of the country to the other. But in the last 12 months of my time at the NAACP, we had 11 court victories against voter suppression. Right? North Carolina, Texas, but also Georgia and other places. What you find is that the litigation victories, no matter how narrow, how pharisaic among the lawyers, represent mobilizing opportunities among the activists. So I can remember being at a mega church in Texas. Now, the people are aware of what's been happening in the Fifth Circuit for some time. But what I tried to do was explain why the litigation was important. And so I said, think about it this way, brothers and sisters. The NAACP, those lawyers, went to court on your behalf, and they put 630,000 votes back in play. 1,000 people stood on their feet and clapped. Not because they're parsing, the precedent. They're clapping because the lawyers are acting on their behalf. They have some sense that this is progress. So with respect to impact litigation in terms of resources, where our public schools, particularly in our urban communities, it's always a fight about resources. To the extent that we have litigation that's tied to public education campaigns, communication campaigns, particularly socially media-driven campaigns, it's powerful in two respects. So even though that may seem like a matter that's hard to get people excited on a street corner, in terms of educational financing being a justiciable matter, here's the thing. If you just simply say, we won something that took 20 years to get, it's something. It's not everything, but it's something.
Yeah. No, thank you for articulating that. And I completely agree with you. I see a lot of people nodding. So I did express some frustration about the slowness of our state, but this is a big deal for our state. And I do think that we will see a lot of activism coming from this litigation. So I thank you for phrasing it that way. A couple of other questions. Well, do we have any other ones you want to add, Pam? I have one I think I want to end with, but let me see what else we might have. All right, so here's another one. Given what we know about the importance of black educators, this is an important one for this audience, what role is the NAACP and what do you think the Graduate School of Education here should be doing to build the pipelines of black educators?
So this is just such an important question because, and it's also an affirmative question. So often we have teachers in traditional public schools being falsely pitted against younger, newer teachers in charter schools. That's an ugly look. If, on the other hand, we talk about the fact that you literally decrease the dropout rate by increasing the number of black teachers, just from the vantage point, this is not a matter of black, white, Latino, Asian teachers being better or worse, but it has everything to do with how people identify, right? That's something we get intuitively, right? So to the extent that many of the HBCUs are beginning to look at this question, to the extent that the Graduate School of Education can create partnerships to expand the pipeline, to get more people to consider teaching. I mean, I think that, Teach for America, wonderful, as a pipeline. But here's our problem. Our problem is that, it's great to get young people at Penn, but we also need young people coming out of Howard and Hampton, or my undergraduate institution, Jackson State University. I'll just be candid with you. I think when I applied to Yale Law School, I generally understood it was in Connecticut. But that was after 3 years at Boston University School of Theology. But I think when I was in Mississippi, I knew it was in New England, roughly. Okay, it wasn't in the South. The point being here is we have to create a universal possibility for young people by exposing them to career options. And that for me has implications for particular kinds of partnerships. I'll give you an example. At the NAACP, I was more likely to get an intern from an Ivy or Little Ivy than from an HBCU. Because the Ivies and Little Ivies could afford to pay someone to come work for us. So when it comes to considering careers in education, we need to leverage the resources of schools that have resources. And, as somebody who believes in the meritocracy, the fact of the matter is when you expand the pool gets better.
Thank you. So a last question. These were excellent questions and tough ones. This is a particularly tough one, I think, and hopefully we can talk about it and then close with something a little bit optimistic. And you are a minister, so I know you can help us do that. So that's a lead into, I'm warning you, this is a hard one.
Oh boy, okay.
So it's a little long, but it's important to read it, I think, because I think it's well done. Doesn't this debate about charter schools versus public schools and that of privatization reflect a broader cultural and social problem about the character of the United States? Namely, do we embrace a winner-take-all system or one that actually is centered on the public as a whole?
Whoever posed that question, if they're not in the Graduate School of Education or in the law school, they should be admitted today. So I think it does say quite a bit about our country and a winner-take-all mindset. That being said, if we think about higher education in this country relative to higher education elsewhere in the world, higher education in this country is certainly profoundly imperfect, inaccessible for many people, but it is accessible in ways unlike any place else in the world. So, for example, where you can come out of high school as an imperfect student, go to community college, and go to a variety of colleges and universities and take your time and mature intellectually. That is not the case in many places in the world. I'll tell you a story only because I just think it's incredibly powerful. I have a friend who is the CEO of one of the leading corporations in the country, leading tech corporations in the country, who came to this country from Korea. In his words, I was in a gang, I was a horrible student. My parents figured the only choice I had was to get to the States. Because if you can get to the States, you can simply repeat a grade. You can repeat your college career. You could do it again and again, but there are multiple paths. This is somebody who's gone to an elite business school. He's quite wealthy. He's done quite well. But he attributes it to the inclusiveness of the higher education system in this country. So when we say a winner take all, we define winners in this country pretty broadly. Imperfectly. But that does give me some hope.
Yeah. Thank you. So in a second, I'm going to ask you to share. That was inspirational. Thank you. Ask you to share any last words of inspiration. As I give you a second to think about them, just reflect a couple of reflections. So when I was on the school board, it was pretty contentious. If you were here for those years, and people would ask me, how do you deal with all of the screaming? And my reaction, and I generally felt it, was people should be angry. People should be frustrated. People should be energized about their schools. They should care about their schools. I would be much more upset if people weren't angry. People weren't coming to the meeting and shouting us. That's okay. That's okay. Now, can we have productive conversations? We should. But that, from my perspective, that it's a good thing that people are upset and want to improve our educational system. Right. Mm-hmm. That is a foundation. Now we need to do a lot more than that, and you've articulated a lot of ways we can do that. But that's a good thing. Yeah. Second thing that I would always say is. We have a long way to go, but we have made a lot of progress. We have more young people in places like Philadelphia graduated from high school than we used to. There were abysmal numbers before, and they're still abysmal, but they're better. We have more people going to college than we used to from our communities. There were abysmal numbers before, and there's still abysmal numbers, but they're better. And so we do have to remember that we have made progress. And the reason, from my perspective, that we made progress is because we do have passion, and we do think, many of us, not enough, but many of us think that this is the fundamental question. So with that filibustering for you.
I appreciate it. One of the things that I've come to appreciate is, if I can paint a picture for you, if you walk into the headquarters of the NAACP in Baltimore, literally every corner of the building is appointed and adorned with American ideals. You see pictures and busts and statues everywhere. When you walk in the door, to your left is a bust of Medgar Evers, who gave his life for the right to vote and civil rights more broadly. The point being is, when I walked up and down those hallways, it gave me a sense of history and progress. Namely, my granddaddy ran for Congress in the 1940s, and he risked his life. He didn't run for Congress because he thought he could win. I mean, Fox News was not there to reassure him of the electoral outcome, okay? He did it to get people to register to vote and to join the NAACP. So the fact that now the issue for us is, yes, voter suppression, but also motivating people to vote. And the fact that you had millennials and African-American women leading the country in voting is, by any objective standard, incredible progress. Incredible progress. And so I think the issue is looking at what we've won and capitalizing on those victories to win even more. And certainly when it comes to the schools, be candid with you, when we think about all those civil rights activists who literally gave their lives to get us access to these schools and to win Head Start, I'll leave you with this little story. My father-in-law, Reverend James Daniel Broom, my wife's dad, he was a civil rights activist in Mississippi. And in Mississippi, they had something called the Sovereignty Commission, which was like an internal FBI. They kept files on all these civil rights activists. They had spies, they taped people. It was terrible. The ACLU sued the state of Mississippi to get them to release the files. In my grandfather's, in my father-in-law's file, were two pieces of paper. One having to do with his activism with the NAACP, and the second having to do with his activism in terms of a Head Start. Education is a civil right, and he was willing to risk his life. And what he did then is the model for what we do now. That is to say, many of us are not called to risk our lives, but we've got to risk everything in this life to ensure that other people have what we were given. That's our legacy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks, particularly for ending with hope and inspiration, and for your both thoughtful and provocative remarks today, and to Provost Pritchett for conducting a very lively and informed conversation and debate. Let's give them one more round of applause for all those. The discussion today exemplified the kind of nuanced discussion of a set of very complex issues that ranged from the purposes of education to the school-to-prison pipeline to the role of community governance and education and the public good. A reasoned and rational discourse that is all too rare in today's world. So I really appreciate the opportunity that you provided for us to step back, maybe take that reasoned pause to dig into some of these issues. The conversation had echoes of both Dewey's admonition that we be wary of simple dichotomies, and Paulo Freire's exhortation that we engage in both the moral urgency of these questions and a radical patience in pursuing the ends that we envision. Jolley, I'm going to use a Yiddish term here, I hope you're kvelling at what you and Stephen envisioned and created. We are all the beneficiaries of your wisdom and vision and generosity. Thank you, and thank you all for being here today.